All right. So we are going to get started for today. And thank you so much for joining us. This webinar is called Outcomes-Based Contracting to Drive Accountability and Data Use. Quick little agenda for today. In just a moment, we're going to do some introductions, and then you are going to learn about outcomes-based contracting from Southern Education Foundation, as well as hear from Santa Ana Unified School District. We'll do a Q&A at the end, but throughout this webinar, if you have any questions at all, you can either throw them into the chat or you can put it into the Q&A, as we have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. So please feel free to throw those into the chat or into the Q&A box. We're going to touch on the Project Unicorn interoperability rubric and how this relates to outcomes-based contracting, and then we will wrap up for today. And I want to introduce our fabulous presenters for today. So I'm going to start with Brittany. Brittany, if you want to give a quick introduction.
Great. Hi, everybody. Really nice to see you all. My name is Brittany Miller, and I'm the Director of Outcomes-Based Contracting with the Southern Education Foundation. Really happy to be able to chat with you all today, and I'll pass it over to Emily.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Emily Wolk. I'm the Executive Director of Research and Evaluation for the Santa Ana School District. And just to give you an idea, we're real close to Disneyland, not too far off there. And then our office really does quite a few things. We focus on data training, program evaluation, analysis, research, data systems, data quality, and data security as well. So with that, I'll pass it back.
Awesome. And we are going to hear more from Brittany and from Emily in just a moment. And for those of you who have not met me, I am Chloe Sanducci, the project manager at Project Unicorn. I'm a former educator and ed tech specialist, and I'm really excited to be here with Project Unicorn and Innovate EDU. And for those of you who don't know what Project Unicorn is, we're a national education coalition of organizations. We have about 19 organizations that form a collaborative, and we promote and support the use of data interoperability, specifically in K-12 with a standards-aligned ecosystem. And we're fully funded by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you are new to Project Unicorn, we just popped the link into the chat. Take a look at our website. And again, we are here to provide resources and support vendors, school systems, and states specifically with data interoperability. And when we say interoperability, what we are defining is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. And you are going to hear in just a moment from Brittany about outcomes-based contracting and how this piece of data interoperability and talking about RFPs, how they can intersect. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Brittany to talk about outcomes-based contracting.
Great. Thanks so much, Chloe. Some of you may be aware of what outcomes-based contracting is, and some of you, maybe a lot of you, don't know a lot. So we're glad to have you here today. And so we'll jump into that definition in a minute, but here are our outcomes for today. So again, we'll start by defining outcomes-based contracting and understand the current landscape. And then we'll also learn how OBC can enable effective data collection, sharing, and analysis practices. And so as Chloe and I were planning for this webinar, we were thinking through, great. So there's like the tools that Project Unicorn offers in terms of how to make sure that the data systems will connect to each other through that data interoperability. And then there's like all the other things that have to happen to make sure the data is actually available, accurate, and people are using it. And so that's where we found that outcomes-based contracting really has a lot of power to drive that collaboration among stakeholders and make good use of good data. And then in addition to that, we'll explore some OEC concepts with colleagues through the use of the chat function. So again, please make sure that as you're putting things into the chat, you're chatting it to everybody. We'll have several opportunities to engage throughout the time today. And then we will also have some stuff at the end in terms of the opportunities and resources that we have available. And so I ask you to stick around for the whole time so that we can share those resources with you as well. Great. And so when we think about outcomes-based contracting, there's a lot of different components of that. But one of my colleagues, Sarah Glover, actually says this really well. And so I'm going to share the clip that she gave to us in terms of how she defines outcomes-based contracting.
I think that one of the most powerful things about outcomes-based contracting, and has been exemplified in our current cohort, is the absolute need to identify specific student outcomes. What we experience and sort of observe with our district leaders is that when we ask the question, what do you want students to know and be able to do? They answer very quickly. But outcomes-based contracting requires that answer to be quite specific, to be measurable, and to have a strategy for collecting data to know whether students in fact are achieving. That forcing mechanism of getting very specific about student outcomes, I literally can watch the district leaders sit in their chairs differently. They get so focused on what kids need to know and be able to do, and that impacts everything in the whole plan, in terms of thinking about implementation, in terms of thinking about the pricing that they want to attach to these contracts, in terms of thinking about viable vendors. So this element, this required element of outcomes-based contracting, very specifically defining student outcomes, just has a transformative effect.
So as they're named, OBC forces everyone to get really clear about the outcomes they want to achieve. And that's just a really important part of the work that we do as district leaders, and is reinforced through the work that we do with outcomes-based contracting. So with that, I'd like to share a little bit about what brings me to this work. So for the better part of the last decade, I worked for Denver Public Schools in a variety of instructional roles. I was a teacher, an instructional coach, chief of staff for academics, and then most recently led out our expanded learning time strategy for our ESSER 3 investments. Now, I've clearly always been an instructional person. So how did I become a contracting person too? When I took on this latest role, I knew that we needed to be strategic and focused about how we were not only spending the available dollars through the ESSER funding, but also the commitments we were making for our most precious resource, which is students' time. So as we know, academic interventions have the potential to be transformative for student learning, but that is not guaranteed, especially in the crowded marketplace we're all experiencing. So outcomes-based contracting helped me understand how to focus our efforts on the thing that matters most, student learning, and put instruction at the forefront of our contracting process. So now I'm both. I'm an instructional leader with a laser-like focus on student learning. And I accomplish that work by ensuring contracting, something that's typically reserved for our operational folks, focuses on instructional outcomes. So now I'm not here to tell you that outcomes-based contracting will magically make students learn, right? The work we do as instructional folks and as educators is just way more complex than that. And as we all know, there is no silver bullet in our work. What I do want to share, though, is that OBC forced me to get crystal clear about why we were investing in the certain academic products and services we were, and have a built-in accountability structure to ensure everyone involved stayed focused on what mattered, working together to meet our shared goals for students. And so that's really what we're going to focus on today, is that accountability structure and how we use data to drive that work. Chloe, can you click the next slide? I don't know why I can't see it. Oh, there we go. Great, thank you. So what is outcomes-based contracting? A substantial part of the payment to the service provider under an OBC model is contingent on meeting agreed upon student outcomes. We have cohorts of districts that we work with for a year where we help them build out an outcomes-based contracting RFP and then subsequent contract, and then do the implementation of services. And for the districts in our cohort, we require at least 40% of the payment is contingent on meeting agreed upon student outcomes. So the way that we really begin to understand how this is shaping the marketplace and how this is shaping the work that we do between districts and providers is that OBC really empowers districts to contract for clear student outcomes. And this last part is where we're really going to dive in today, it compels mutual accountability for achieving them. Now, this work has been available in other industries for a while, but it's fairly new to education, particularly for meeting academic outcomes. So before we even launched the work that we do with districts directly, there was a year-long feasibility study conducted out of the Center for Education Policy Research, or CEPR, at Harvard. From that work, we have now begun working with districts directly and have 10 districts across the country that we currently are directly partnered with. And there's other districts that have also adopted this model based on the open source resources available on our website that I'll go over at the end of our presentation today. And then also just want to give gratitude to the philanthropic sources that make the works possible. So that's Walton, Schmidt, Gates, America Achieves, Accelerate, and Schusterman. And in terms of the districts that we have been partnering with, you can see them here for the first and second cohort. And Santa Ana Unified School District is on that list for the second cohort. And so thrilled to have Emily here today so that she can share a little bit about the work that she's been leading out in Santa Ana. And so clearly the most salient goal of outcomes-based contracting is to make sure that district spending is truly connected to improving student outcomes. But we also intend for OBC to disrupt the marketplace as well. First, we want OBC to spur innovation. When we switch payment to be for outcomes instead of for services, that allows for and even instigates innovation to achieve those outcomes in different ways. We also hope that OBC has the opportunity to break this current cycle between vendors and providers, or providers and districts rather, in which little is expected in terms of closing achievement gaps. And so neither districts nor vendors are to blame when nothing happens, right? We hear this a lot from both sides of the contracting process, where the provider is saying, like, we just need the district to pay more attention to what we're doing and help us figure out how to improve. And we hear the district saying, why isn't the provider doing what we need them to? And what we found is a lot of that is because there isn't the level of clarity that we need up front in order to really drive that continuous improvement work and really make sure that everybody's held accountable to meeting those shared goals for students. We also believe that OBC has the opportunity to put the pressure on prices, which will help ensure sustainability in tighter funding environments, especially as we begin to look forward to the ESSER funding cliff. And so now I'm going to ask for that first opportunity to respond in the chat. So based on these goals, would love to hear what about this model of contracting seems most useful. So please go ahead and respond in the chat now. Great. So Sunil, thanks so much for chatting in. It aligns purchase decisions to student outcomes. It's absolutely true. Yeah, thank you, Robert. I think that notion of shared responsibility is so important for the work that we do. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Tal. It forces the conversation between the salesiness and into the brass tacks of how solutions will work in various capacity structures and contexts. Absolutely, yeah. So you have to have that clear theory of action for, like, what do you actually want to have occur when you purchase this thing for children, right? And then when you get to that level of conversation, it really gets down to the solutions and how you're planning on implementing the work. Great. And so feel free to keep chatting in those elements that seem most useful, but we're going to move to the next one, which is, what about this model of contracting seems most challenging? So a few more on useful, it centers students and it gives small providers that are evidence-based competing with larger providers. Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of providers across the board have been really happy about this model because they believe in their product, right? And they want to have the opportunity to focus in on how they're making those outcomes actually come to life with children. What about what's most challenging? Yep, extending an already lengthy procurement process in K-12. Yep, our district leaders can definitely speak to that, right? There's nothing easy about how procurement happens in school districts with all the different regulations. And then another challenge that vendors are less likely to take accountability for student outcomes. They will indicate the outcomes are connected to instructional delivery. I'm not sure if I understand that one, Rachel, but I think we'll address that when we look at the outcomes that the district is pricing for, because the district is the one that's actually choosing what those outcomes are, what to measure, and when specific skills and or intangibles. Yes, I think that that's a huge one to think about in terms of how we're measuring the things that we care most about and how we're finding ways to do that effectively. Great. Would it not be a shorter process that is straight to the point? Yeah, I think that this notion of how much time it takes is something that we definitely work a lot with our districts on. I think that the thing that takes the longest that we found with districts is actually like getting all of the people on the same page about what they care about and what they want to measure. Once you actually do the work of getting all of those decisions made, though, that front end work ends up paying off in large dividends on the back end, because then you're not going back to the drawing board over and over again between the provider and district to say, like, that's not what we agreed to, or it is what we had agreed to, right? It just offers that level of clarity so that when you actually start executing on the contract, you're saving a lot of time focused on what might have been, whether or not the services were the right things, and focusing more on how do we improve upon what we agreed to ensure that we're really hitting those outcomes, and how are we using data to measure that along the way. What happens if a district struggles to meet their commitment? Yeah, so we can talk about that as we get into the presentation. And then in terms of the additional risk to the vendor, are they adjusting their prices up? So yes, Robert, we'll show you the rate card in a little while here, and that will speak to kind of how the pricing structure is set up and how we work with districts on that. Great. Okay, so hearing a lot of different things that seem valuable and challenging about this work. And so we'll cover what we can today, and then also we'll share some opportunities for upcoming engagement and resources that we have available so that you all can continue to learn about this work. So now we're going to focus on one of the key elements that really makes outcomes-based contracting function, which is using data to drive continuous improvement. So as you likely know, Project Unicorn is centered around data-driven decision-making and how providers can integrate into district data systems. And so we're excited to share this content with you today, as OBC provides an opportunity to embed this work throughout the life cycle of that relationship. So based on the work done to date, the Southern Education Foundation, in partnership with Third Sector, has produced a playbook organizing outcomes-based contracting into 5 steps. And that playbook's available open sourced for free on our website. And so while we won't have time to learn about all of the steps in detail today, we'll dig into one of the key concepts represented in steps 4 and 5, which is aligning district systems and driving continuous improvement work. So when we think about this work of aligning district systems and driving continuous improvement, it's important for all stakeholders to be cognizant of the roles and responsibilities to ensure students are positively impacted by using the product or service. And so the way that we talk about this is that OPC compels mutual accountability between the district, the school, and the vendor. This plays out in the work we do to align data systems to prepare for continuous improvement to occur, right? And so when we're thinking about that triad relationship, that really gives you the opportunity to think about, like, what are the different data sources we need to use in order to drive toward that mutual accountability and ultimately positively impact student achievement. And so under an outcomes-based contracting model, data sharing and reporting must be memorialized in the OBC RFP and subsequent OBC contract. And there's the payment tied to at least some elements of the data actually really force that to get super clear with the district and the provider before services begin to be delivered. And so districts we work with spend a lot of time collaborating internally to include the specific timeline of how and when they'll collect, analyze, and share the available data. We then support districts to ensure the system is ready to leverage these data into the next year when their OBC projects begin. So as I shared before, Emily, my colleague from Santa Ana and USC in California, has been doing this work in her district. And so in a little while here, she'll share an example of her thinking in this area from her outcomes-based contracting work. And all of this detailed work on setting up clear roles and responsibilities for data sharing enables that continuous improvement work to happen across the system. And so in our cohorted learning model, we spend a lot of time talking with districts about 2 kinds of outcomes: the payment outcomes and the process outcomes. As you see in the definitions, payment outcomes are those outcomes that are tied to payment, and they're listed in the rate card, and they're actually assigned a price. right? And so that's a whole other session, right? How do we actually price the outcomes? But there's a process we use to do so. And so there are certain outcomes that are actually assigned a price instead of just a service delivery model. And then we also have process outcomes. And so the process outcomes are used to inform ongoing learning and continuous improvement. And they're listed in the contract expectations so that we all, again, have all of that memorialized in order to drive continuous improvement. So to begin, we'll discuss data collection, sharing, and analysis of payment outcomes. And so the best way to do that is through this example. So this is a real life example from District 11 in Colorado Springs that they put into their contract. And so you'll see that in this example, they've actually included a timeline specifically for the administration of the STAR assessment, the assessment that was being used to drive their payment outcomes. And in this table, they've also included all of the steps necessary to move from administration to payment and the timeline for this payment to occur. I'm going to give you a second to look at the content on the slide and would love to hear what questions or observations you have about this timetable. Great. So it looks like we have a question in here. Does this tend to move back in the school year, the payment to vendors, since you don't have some performance data until much later than services are delivered? Yeah, that's a great question. And so for the way that the payment works, they have articulated the timeline in May. They actually started this intervention in February. And so the base payment, which you see at the bottom of the timetable, is invoiced on a monthly basis. And so that base payment is provided on service delivery like we would have in a traditional contract. And then some of the payment is at the end of the contract after the assessment has been given. It really depends on the assessment source, especially when we have interventions that are going for the full year. This was a spring pilot for this district. And so in the case of an intervention going all year, you may have, like a mid-year assessment point that triggers payment as well, in which case payment would be issued at that time as well. Great. Well, if you have other questions, please keep them coming and we'll move into some of the process outcomes. So again, in addition to identifying the payment outcomes, we also have the process outcomes that are identified by the district and the provider. So frequently, these data will be available on a more regular basis and will serve as leading indicators that point to the likelihood of meeting the outcomes established in the rate card. And so this is a list of some of the process outcomes we've seen in some of the RFPs from our districts with a specific focus on high impact tutoring. And so you'll see that we've also included the typical timeline for each of these types of progress outcomes, but this is obviously very dependent on the district context and what product or service is. And so with that, those also go into the contract. They're not always in the RFP because they tend to be more specific to the provider district relationship, but they are something that we memorialize in the contract. And so from those two sets of outcomes, the payment and the process outcomes, then comes the real work of how does that work actually happen in a district? And so with that, I'm thrilled to pass it over to Emily Woke from Santa Ana. She's going to share the rate card, which is the tool that we use to identify what payment will be given for each outcome, in addition to the service delivery, which is the base payment at the bottom. And then she'll also talk through the example of how she thought about those roles and responsibilities in her district. Em, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brittany. So again, my name is Emily Wolk. I'm the Executive Director of Research and Evaluation for our school district. This is the first time that we've really embarked on outcomes-based contracting. I think like many districts and organizations, we have always kind of done this the traditional way where we're paying for services when we're looking at any providers. In this case, just as a context, this intervention will be intensive tutoring. It's going to be happening after school in our extended learning kind of realm. So good to keep in mind. The other thing I'd like to say is, why was this appealing in the first place? I think for us, as data people, I know you're out there. So we always want to get people to use their data, and we also want them to be able to use the data to drive some of the decision making. And in evaluation, we're always looking at the impact of programs to see, did it make a difference for kids? I mean, that's really why we're in this work, right? Because especially coming out of the pandemic, we know that our kids have a lot of need. And there's a lot of, holes that we can, through intensive tutoring or other providers, we can kind of work and build on what's going on during the day, and then extend that learning into the after school with providers. So with that, you're leading with this outcomes-based contracting with evaluation. It's baked into the formula. So when I first heard it, my little ears perked up and I said, wow, this kind of turns our whole kind of way of doing business upside down in a positive way, right? Where we're going to be building in roles and responsibilities. We're going to be looking at, what are the data elements? We're going to be collecting the data, which sometimes we're asked, as you know, we come in on the end and people want us to evaluate their programs. And sometimes we're just not able to do it because the components aren't in place. So with the outcomes-based contracting, and you can see here, you have to start from the very beginning in that dark orange sort of rectangle there at the top. You have to identify exactly who you're targeting as a group. So it made us in Santa Ana define what it was that we wanted for our kids and kind of dream like, what would it be that we want them to have as outcomes, not just what are the services being provided, right? So very different. So for us, it was our 3rd through 5th grade kids. They're going to be our students who are experiencing homeless. We're prioritizing them. Those who are in foster care, our English language learners, which is a very large group. We're about 42% English learners. So that's a really large group of kids, especially at those earlier grades before they've made that redesignation or transition into fluent English speakers. And then we need a lot of work in the area of reading, foundational reading in particular. So we had to define very clearly who those were. And as simple as that sounds, it actually took us some time. Then we were able to define what our outcomes were. So you can see there's kind of a tiered approach there. We have outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3 that we were really moving towards. We defined our metrics, which, yay, we were able to do that before we start the intervention and go to contracting and selecting and going to RFP and everything. So those components were critical and baked into the process, where before it was just, you select a vendor, you go to RFP about the services that you wanted, and, that was the traditional route. So with that, let's move on, if we could, to the next card. And before we move on, I did want to say one thing is, maybe go back, I'm so sorry. I forgot something, that for each one of those tiers, you can see on the far right-hand side what the price per student was and the outcome payment would be overall. So vendors know exactly what they're getting into, providers know what they're getting into, as well as ourselves, right? So we have fleshed out all of those components. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So for us in Santa Ana, we wanted to be able to make sure that we were really clear. I think Brittany really stressed that, and it is really important, right? That when we go to RFP, we actually have our contract, they go out simultaneously, because we want to make sure that they're able as a provider to see what are the elements that we're expecting and what they can expect from us as well. So both components. So there are 2 types of metrics, one tied to payment and one tied to outcomes. I'm going to go over the payment metrics first, and then we could talk a little bit about the process outcomes as well. So the first element, and on this table below, or where you can see that here, is the data element. We have the purpose, the time and the frequency of data collection, who's responsible for what, who's doing the analysis, and then the timeline. All of that has to be played out ahead of time. This is where we feel like we're investing time, but I think it's really going to pay off in the end. I just know it is. So with a data element, the first one, we use NWEA. It's an assessment that we use for universal screening, and we also use it for as an interim assessment as well. We give it 3 times a year for this particular grade level, 3 through 5. The payment that we're going to be doing, it is tied to payment because this is one of our outcomes. Gosh, wouldn't it be awesome if we were able to achieve X with this intervention? The timeline and frequency, it's already part of our process. We didn't want to overload our people with adding on additional assessments beyond really what we absolutely needed. So that's something that we already give. It's going to be done in December. We actually have it in the fall. In December, we can show growth in that way for our first cohort of kids that are going to be going through the intervention starting in September through December. And then who's responsible for the data collection and sharing? Well, that's us. SAUSD, we're going to be preparing in R&E. We're going to be preparing those rosters for our teachers, and our teachers are going to be giving that assessment just like they normally do, nothing different. The difference is you can see on that in that box under responsibility for data collection and sharing is we're actually going to share that file, that data with our provider, with our vendor. So it is more collaborative and they can see, who's achieving what. And then responsible for data analysis, we're going to do the data analysis, but we're also going to do it in tandem with a vendor. So it'll be like a validation process. We're going to prepare dashboards, identifying student performance, how they did, what were the outcomes, and then the vendor is going to do the same process, and then we're going to compare the outcomes. Hopefully they'll be matchy-matchy. And then plan the timeline. We know that we want to be able to make payment in a good way, right? People need to get paid. So as soon as the data are loaded and the process is done and the validation is completed, then we will send those figures to our purchasing area, and they will be able to get it ready for payment. And then for our BPST, that's an additional, it's the basic phonics skills test, I think. We have acronyms for everything, don't we? So it's a payment metric that we'll be using again. It is part of what we do as far as like for classroom teachers, they use it for kids that are not at the 50th percentile based on that universal screener, that they're not a typical achievement. And so they need something more in depth. However, we're going to ask, because we're expecting it of all of our kids in that extended learning program that participate in this program, that our extended learning staff be trained so that they can give that assessment. And then they will be providing that for us. And we in research and evaluation will be collecting that data, which we're not currently doing. So it's really cool in that we're nudging our system to be more data minded, right? And getting those structures that benefit all kids, not only those in the after school or extended learning program. And then we'll be again preparing that data as part of the dashboards for internal accountability for ourselves, and so that we can also visualize and get that downloadable file that will be helping with the payment of students depending on how they achieve. And then again, the validation process. The last one on that chart, which I do want to say, is that's a process outcome, meaning it's not tied to payment. But in Santa Ana, and I think in many other districts, social emotional learning is really key. We know holistically that kids, there's achievement, and there's that holistic part, how they're feeling, especially coming out of the pandemic. So we're going to pilot and create a new tool in Santa Ana, or we're looking at the DESA2, which is another instrument that we might be able to use that we can do pre and post. And then once we have that sort of sorted out, then maybe next year we'll bake that into our formula for payment. We'll see how that goes. So, and we'll be using that internally for us, and we'll also be sharing with the providers as well. So I think what's really amazing about this is everything is kind of laid out prior to going to RFP and the contract so that everybody knows their responsibilities. And it gives us also an opportunity, which I love, to nudge our district one step closer to using data more and more to determine what we want for our kids, which ultimately is the heart of education, right? We want better for our students, especially coming out of COVID with the needs that we're seeing with our student population. So thank you so much for allowing me to share today. I super appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much, Em. So just want to pick up on a couple of things that Emily shared. One of them is the clarity of the roles and responsibilities that the team put together as they were going through this process, right? And so I think like a different way of approaching that question that came in, or the potential downside of using an outcomes-based contract model, is that it extends an already lengthy procurement process, right? I don't know if it extends it, but like it makes better use of the time, right? Because you're really focusing in on what are those shared roles and responsibilities and how are you getting to that clarity, so that, as Em said, and I was guilty of doing this as a district leader to my evaluation team too, I don't show up at the end of the day and say, hey, can you evaluate this? And they say, you didn't collect the right data. So no, I'm sorry, I can't evaluate this. The other is that mutual accountability that in addition to, the academics folks and the school-based people and the procurement team has and the provider has for the outcomes, there's also accountability on the part of the research and evaluation team, right? They're developing these dashboards to really get much more clear about the data, that they now have a better understanding of what the academics team values and how to really curate that data in a way that'll be meaningful for this contract, but can also be meaningful for beyond the contract. She also mentioned the importance of validating the data alongside the vendor. And so being able to do that cross-validation between the vendor and the district gives that extra layer of scrutiny to the data and understanding of how students are performing, where there may be, anomalies coming up in the data that you can address through that really tight relationship. And then,
go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to add one thing. It popped into my mind was the attendance data, which we didn't note on there, but it's related to base payment. That's going to be even at a more frequent pace of reviewing the data. I talked with our program people. They're anticipating that they're going to be reviewing that data on a weekly basis. Yeah. So it's just driving a data culture that I was hoping for, but to see it happen is kind of cool. Like it's what you dream of is, research and evaluation. This is what we dream of. Well, use your data.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Em. And then the other one that she named a little bit is the BPST, right? And so that was a metric that the curriculum and instruction team had been really trying to get teachers to use more frequently, specifically for students that were struggling to learn how to read. And through the conversations that now have occurred between curriculum and instruction, the extended learning team, procurement, and then Em's team and research and evaluation, they have committed to developing a new dashboard for that so that they can really track that data. And then for the SEL outcomes, there's an opportunity to try out a new data source that they have been interested in evaluating, but haven't had it as part of, the strategic way they're using data thus far. So it also gives the opportunity to try out some new measurement systems. So just wanted to lift up some of those highlights from the Santa Ana example. Thank you very much, Em, for sharing that work with us.
Absolutely, Brittany. Thank you.
Great. And so we have these questions for reflection, which are under an OBC model. What are the implications for data collection, sharing, and analysis practices based on what you've heard today? And then how has your thinking shifted around contracting as a vehicle for data sharing best practices? I'll give you a few moments to respond to that. We do still have the resources and opportunities coming. So we'll go to that in just a moment. Great. So I think that for me, the contracting process in particular is something that, like I said at the beginning, I didn't used to pay a whole lot of attention to, right? I knew we had to go through this process just to get the thing that we wanted to implement, but I didn't really realize how transformative it could be to go through this model. And it really does memorialize what you care about in a document that's very public, right? These are published on our board docs, they're published, for public consumption. And so once you commit to that in that really public way, then there's a greater guarantee that at that systems level, you'll be able to ensure the conditions happen to ensure that the work actually gets done and that you're able to use that data to continuously improve student outcomes, both within that relationship with the provider. And then as Em spoke to, there's going to be some larger implications for their system overall and how they're going to be able to use that data. And so with that, we'll go to the resources and opportunities that we have available. So we got a very small preview of the work that we do with outcomes-based contracting. And there are multiple future opportunities that we wanted to make everybody aware of. So one is on the outcomes-based contracting website, and Chloe already put that link in the chat to our website. We have open source resources available that includes a lot of different documents that I'll talk about on the next slide. In addition to that, we have a convening coming up in Dallas, Texas from September 19th to 21st, and that is open to districts, state agencies, and advocates, so nonprofit organizations that we partner with, such as Project Unicorn and others. And there's additional information about that upcoming convening available on our website. And we encourage anybody that falls in those categories to join us in Dallas to learn more about the work and actually really dive into how this functions. And then finally, our highest touch option, which is what Emily's team is a part of, is the cohort. So we have a year-long cohort learning experience, and it's open to school districts committed to launching an outcomes-based contract in 2024. So we have an interest form available here that we can drop in the chat as well for you, and feel free to fill that out if your district is already ready to commit. One of the things we say is that the convening is a really good opportunity to kind of see if this is a good fit for your district, and then register for the year-long cohort experience if it ends up being a good fit. That's what ended up happening with Santa Ana. They came to the convening and then signed up for the cohort, and now here they are leading the way in the work that they do in their district. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to highlight some of those resources that we do have available on our website. So there's an outcomes-based contracting playbook that really walks through the 5 steps, and there's a how-to guide of outcomes-based contracting, so a lot more details in there about the work. We have a rate card calculator. So somebody asked, how do you actually calculate what the student outcomes pricing is? And there's a whole pricing strategy that goes behind that, which is memorialized in the rate card calculator. And then we also have a continuous improvement checklist that really goes through those different ways to use the data to drive that continuous improvement work. So feel free to check those out on your own as well.
All right, so we have a couple questions in the Q&A box, and feel free to chat more questions in or put it into the Q&A. So the first question is, have these worked best with in-year measurements like an RIT score? What about longer term outcomes like graduation rate that might take up to several years to measure?
Yeah, so the way that we think about that is that you would want more of the payment to be something that was closer to the direct intervention that was being provided by the provider. And so that's where more of your RIT score or conditional growth percentile is used a lot, would come into the payment outcomes. There are some outcomes that, again, are really important to the district that they really care about, but may not necessarily be as directly connected to the provider. So the way that we would think about that is you could use them as a payment outcome, but we wouldn't suggest using it as the majority of the payment outcome, because it's really not going to tell you whether or not the services provided actually had the impact on students really directly, and we're looking for that direct correlation. And then it also, because it's a little bit further out and will take longer to get to, it just wouldn't make as much sense in terms of that tight relationship, as it's not necessarily something you can't tie payment to. It may actually be better suited for a process outcome if you're in a multi-year relationship with a provider. And were you going to add anything into that one?
Yeah, I was just actually going to just say, I completely agree with you, Brittany. I think one of the things that we're always looking for when we're doing any kind of evaluation or setting up metrics is, what are you hoping to get? What are the goals, right? What are the goals? And then what are we going to use to be able to measure where we're getting closer to those goals? And I think that certainly applies for us. That's when we use our RIT score, the RIT score from NWEA. And because it's tied with, we're able to get a growth score, we can see whether students, and because it's norm referenced, we can see how they're doing relative to other students. So are they achieving beyond what you would hope to see typically, that was a really great tool for us to be able to use. And then for our BPST, are they meeting that benchmark of what we need for foundational reading? So we really try to first decide what are our outcomes, and then how are we going to gather, or what are our metrics, and then what instruments do we have? So that's the kind of the flow that we used in our district that was encouraged by when we were working in the cohort.
Great. And another question was, how did you determine the value of each of the outcomes 1 to 4?
Yeah, so at a high level, we use a tool called the rate card. So that was the first slide that Emily shared with you. And the way that she and her team got to those metrics was through the rate card calculator, which has a variety of inputs that you give to the rate card in order to determine what the different payments are. Is there anything that you want to say specifically about your experience with that part of the process?
Yeah, I think, we were kind of like, how do we do this? We're not really sure. So one of the pieces that I think made us feel a lot better, I guess, because it's our first time, was having the attendance be part of that base payment. I think that was really important for us to say, we want to be able to provide our providers, our vendors, if our students, and that keeps us accountable too, right? We got to get the kids to them to be able to provide those services. That's part of that partnership component, but that was one of our pieces. And then if they hit this standard of growth, which is what we're hoping to see, 51 to the 65th percentile exceed that typical growth, let's give them that extra bit. And then if they, knock it out of the park, let's provide that extra incentive. So it was a lot of talking about it, but also looking and seeing what other districts were doing. That actually provided a lot of guidance for us to see, and then looking at our own data to see where are kids achieving right now, to see whether, is that possible? Is that realistic? So I would say all of those things put together.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the, important work that we do is developing a marketplace for outcomes, right? It's not something that's existed in the K-12 education space in the past. And it is a model that has existed in other places, including in the social service area. And so, we talk about it being more of an art than a science, right? There's not one right answer to how you're going to price an outcome. And we do have a lot of tools to help inform how you would do that in order to make sure that it is a reasonable agreement between the district and the provider.
Great. And the next question is, do the contracts have any sort of contingency included for external factors that could be very disruptive to achieving an outcome? Thinking of something like a hurricane or earthquake that could disrupt a school year and thus outcomes measured for either academic or SEL type measures.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to the hurricane or earthquake one necessarily, but there are some standard clauses that are in the agreement as we would expect to see otherwise in terms of right to terminate the agreement, those kinds of things. And then in addition to that, there are specific elements of that mutual accountability where there's responsibilities of the district and responsibilities of the provider. So the thing that Em was alluding to is that in the contract, several of our districts have agreed to and put in their contract with their provider that if students don't show up for the intervention at least 70% of the time, then they would be eligible to still receive payment for the outcomes, even if those students didn't meet the outcomes up to the outcomes caps, which is where the budget comes in for district leaders. But with that, it gives the clarity around what the district is really responsible for, right? Because if the provider is offering the service and their people are ready and prepared and all the things, and the district doesn't have the kids show up, then there's nothing the provider can do about that. And that actually is a really empowering factor as a district leader to be able to say, when I was leading this work in Denver to my schools and to my team, I'm not going to pay for empty rooms and then also pay for outcomes that students don't achieve. So we need to get students there for 70% of the time or find a third way. And that really empowers, the system overall to wrap their arms around this and say, this is something we really care about. And therefore, we're going to make sure it happens. And then on the provider side, the accountability metric that we've put in is the student tutor match rate. So making sure that in the case of high impact tutoring, you have a consistent tutor, since that's really important to the student experience. In educational technology, we would be looking at different outcomes that would, or expectations on the provider side that would be more aligned with what their service delivery is. Did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think really working very closely with our contracts people was absolutely critical, because we have standard contracts, but the language had to look kind of different. There are many elements that were the same. And so, language about other phenomena that we may have to consider that may disrupt some of those, the opportunity to learn. Those are kind of part of like a typical contract that may be baked into your own existing template. But working with the contracts people, and then also too, this was our first time, so we had added new language, taking out a couple things in our contract, so that it really reflected what we were hoping to achieve and be realistic. I think that was the piece that our lawyer said, a contract is just a set of agreements that you're able to, enforce on one side or the other side. So are these things that are able to be enforced within that? So they're looking over the contract currently to make sure that the language is clear and that we can on both parts abide by it. So work with your people. That's what I would say.
And a few more questions here. So during the RFP process, how do you evaluate which solution is most likely going to deliver the desired results and therefore is selected? What sort of commitments does the district provide in terms of fidelity of implementation of the solution?
Yeah, great. So I think that goes to that point around the attendance part, right? So we try to figure out, like, what are the elements that are going to be measurable, are aligned to the research, and aren't so many that you're spending all your time in the nitty gritty of some sort of bureaucracy that you've set up for yourself, right? And so by just naming that one thing, right, students have to be there 70% of the time, that gives the guarantee that the district will do their part. And then on the provider side, same thing, making it a very small number of things so that innovation and partnership can occur between the provider and district to really drive towards student learning. And so if you need to change something else that falls outside of those parameters, then you have the opportunity to innovate forward and really think through, what's the third way that we can make sure that we're getting to those student outcomes that we all care about.
I was just going to add one thing to that, and I'm not sure if that was the intent of the question, but I did find it really interesting, is when we were going through this process, when we were working with our teaching and learning folks, our colleagues, it was really interesting because we're so used to micromanaging our interventions. Like, they wanted to say, they need to do this in their intervention and it needs to look like this. And I think, and they have to use this curriculum. And I kept saying, let's pull back here. What we're doing is we're trying to set up the outcomes that we want and expect. How they get there, let them do their gig. This is why we're paying them, to get these outcomes. Let them do what it is they do to get to that. Now, that means, obviously we will support them by doing our obligations, meeting with them in partnership about how things are going and talking about attendance and how the interventions are going. But let them, we're paying for outcomes. And not the traditional way of looking at it from a service perspective. Let them do their thing. So it was a big shift for us.
Okay, and another question, what about disproportionate discipline?
I'm not sure I understand the question. If the person wants to clarify, then I'm happy to try to answer it.
Yeah, we can go back to that one. And then another question, this is the last one. What sort of reaction have you had from vendors proposing this type of agreement? Where have you found common ground, and which aspects have been most challenging for negotiating a contract?
Yeah. So I think that overall, we've had a really positive reaction from providers. And it's fascinating for any providers on the line. Districts are constantly like, are providers actually going to partner with us in this work? And what we found from the provider end is resolutely yes, right? For our first round of RFPs, we had anywhere between 9 and I think 18 vendors respond. One was just closed for Uplift to CMO in Texas. And I think that they had maybe like 13 or 14 vendors respond. And so we are seeing that vendors are really interested in this model. I think it's really coming down to like, how are you making sure that those elements of mutual accountability are really well established so that every party feels like this is actually something we can accomplish because the adults in the system are doing the work to make sure that we can get to those student outcomes.
All right. If there are any other questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. We're going to actually wrap up for today since we're right at the hour. But if you have any questions, you can reach out to Project Unicorn and we will connect you with either Brittany or Emily. And just to wrap up really quickly and to tie this all together, one resource that Project Unicorn has when thinking about outcomes-based contracting or thinking about RFPs is the interoperability rubric. This rubric was an effort to create a shared language for school districts, states, and vendors. And Project Unicorn has developed a rubric to evaluate tools about the key aspects of interoperability. This is a living document, and this allows stakeholders to evaluate where their efforts are and their tools are for their journey towards interoperability. And this is used for vendors as well as school systems to implement and use within their RFPs. So just interesting to think about that when we talk about this type of outcomes-based contracting. And we will chat in the rubric for you to see the different things that are measured on that rubric. And after this webinar, we have a bunch of resources as well as our YouTube channel. This recording will be up on our YouTube channel for you to watch again or to share out. And you can check that out on our resources page. But we want to thank you all for joining today. And thank you so much to Brittany and Emily for your wonderful presentation. And we can't wait to see you all put in those interest forms. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Really appreciate the time.